In its heyday, travelling by rail was seen as one of the most glamorous and romantic ways of getting around, especially in the US. Relaxing at the bar, being served 3 hot, full meals a day, and enjoying a cigarette while watching the scenery roll by the windows was truly the way to travel. Running these services, however, wasn't quite as glamorous as riding on them, and it took a lot of hard work to keep passengers happy. Naturally, this made railroads hotspots for labour movements and unions in the early 20th century, but more importantly, it helped make them the linchpin for almost every American civil rights movement. Established in 1862 by George Pullman, the Pullman Company specialised in building sleeper cars and leasing them to railroads to use on long journeys, so passengers had a private and comfortable place to sleep. In 1868, Pullman began employing porters and maids to cater to first-class passengers riding in his carriages. From making their beds to looking after their children, anything to provide them with a comfortable journey. After the US Civil War ended in 1865, many former slaves were left looking for work across the country, happy to take any job that didn't leave them toiling under the hot sun for weeks at a time. Pullman took this opportunity and hired many African Americans as porters, with the promise of a steady wage and better working conditions. Their duties involved carrying luggage, making beds, giving wake-up calls, shining shoes, and generally tending to the needs of passengers. Maids, meanwhile, would look after children and primarily tend to female passengers, helping style their hair, do their makeup, and give manicures, though only one maid was ever on a train at a time, and only for longer journeys. By the 1920s, Pullman was one of the single largest employers of black workers in the US and had used this fact to present itself as a benevolent and welcoming company among black communities, helping fund various black newspapers, churches, and other organizations. The porters themselves were seen as significant figures among their own communities, as they were often well educated and their work demanded they be highly civil. Despite the seemingly better lifestyle, like most companies, Pullman hadn't really hired so many black workers out of the kindness of their hearts. From the start, Pullman realized they could hire black porters and pay them significantly less compared to white workers, and given that Pullman was looking for workers who were used to serving others, it made sense to hire former slaves. The working conditions too were rough. Porters on average worked 73 hours a week, 10% of this time being unpaid cleaning and preparation work between journeys, and were expected to do everything asked of them. Abuse to porters, both physical and verbal, was common, with passengers often referring to porters as George after George Pullman, a practice that was common during slavery where slaves would be referred to by the name of their master. Should a porter mess up, he would need to do everything in his power to make amends, as just one complaint to the company could get him fired.
And he was going to show his friends how to treat you know, and he booted me. Of course, and I was in the process of cleaning it up.
Porters spent a long time on the move, had little time off, and all for poor pay. In 1925, porters earned an average of $810 a year, with an extra $100 or so in tips from passengers on top of that. While at first this doesn't seem too bad, porters had to pay for their own uniforms, and while on duty had to pay for their own food and quarters. On top of that, the cost of any items such as towels and water jugs stolen by passengers would come out of their wages too, leaving them missing up to half of their earnings. The wages become even more criminal when you consider the average salary of factory workers at the time, which was higher than that of porters. And remember that factory workers worked half the hours of porters and didn't have to pay the company for food, uniforms, and the utilities required to work. To make things worse, porters weren't even allowed to apply for jobs working as conductors, despite the fact they often did the same work as a conductor for a fraction of the pay. In the early 1900s, many railroad workers began making attempts to unionize, demanding better pay and working conditions. The Pullman Company was no different, and after a strike in 1894 resulted in around 70 deaths and intervention from the army, Pullman was keen to squash any attempt made to start a union, hiring spies and firing anyone who so much as tried to start a movement. Even when workers did manage to start forming a union, the black porters weren't included. By the 1920s, enough porters got together and decided to form a union of their own. Pullman countered this by offering pension plans and shares in the company, but this did little to sway porters who were more concerned with the current pay and conditions of their work. Any porter who headed the union would be immediately fired, and so in 1925, the party reached out to prominent black activist Asa Philip Randolph. Randolph agreed to attend a meeting, and eventually agreed to help lead a union given he was an outside influence and thus free from retaliation from Pullman. On the night of the 25th of August, 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, shortened to just the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was formed. Their motto, "Fight or be slaves." Despite many porters joining the Brotherhood, it took some time before they could gain any traction. The Interstate Commerce Commission refused their request to investigate wages in 1927, and in 1928 the Brotherhood threatened a strike. However, this was called off just hours before it was planned to take place. Strangely, an attempt to mock porters helped bolster their resolve. In 1914, the Society for the Prevention of Calling Sleeping Car Porters George was founded as a joke by a lumber baron named George W. Dulaney, who sent out thousands of invitations to people whose first or last names were George. Members supposedly included Admiral George Dewey, King George V, and baseball player George Babe Ruth. In 1926, the society managed to persuade the Pullman Company to install a rack in each car which displayed the name of the porter on duty, helping decrease instances of passengers referring to porters as George. Despite the society being formed as a joke, it still showed that organization was capable of producing results. Most efforts to spread word and plans of the union took place around Chicago, Oakland, and St. Louis, but meetings had to take place in secret, else employees faced the risk of getting fired. Pullman even went as far as to hire spies or bribe other porters to listen in on meetings and give the names of any and all porters present.
We had a meeting at a certain home once, and the company found out that we had this meeting. So they called the husband in and asked him about it. The porter was able to show by his time sheet that he was out of town. But his wife held the meeting.
By the 1930s, especially during the start of the Great Depression, the Brotherhood's future started to become uncertain. Randolph and the other union leaders did their best to try and keep the Brotherhood going, but perhaps one of the greatest assets they had was Rosina Tucker and the International Ladies Auxiliary. The ILA helped raise a significant amount of money through parties, donations, and clever financing, not just for the Brotherhood, but also several other equal rights campaigns for both women and black Americans. Rosina Tucker herself was also a very strong and determined woman. When Pullman fired her husband due to her connection with the union, she marched into the supervisor's office, slammed her fist on his desk, and made clear that she didn't work for Pullman and her husband had nothing to do with her work, ending the conversation by saying, "I want you to take care of this situation or I will be back." Her husband was rehired shortly afterwards.
The men here were afraid, and somebody had to go around and keep them informed as to what was being done. So all of the literature, all of the propaganda was sent to me. And I would secretly go among the men and disseminate this news and collect dues. Now that's how I became active in this brotherhood.
Despite falling down to around 650 members in 1933, with Tucker's financial assistance, Randolph's determination, and the will of the rest of the union leaders, the Brotherhood managed to persevere, facing stern opposition from the company union created by Pullman in an attempt to quell the Brotherhood. When the Railway Emergency Act was published that same year banning company unions, for some reason Pullman was exempt, and so the Brotherhood had to campaign hard to make Pullman a part of the act. In 1934, the act was amended to include Pullman, and the Brotherhood quickly contacted the National Mediation Board, requesting the right to represent porters in matters of collective bargaining. Pullman naturally reorganized their union to oppose the Brotherhood, and so the National Mediation Board put it to a vote, starting on the 27th of May 1935 and ending on the 27th of June. The Brotherhood won with 5,931 votes. Now the official union for Pullman's porters, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the first black union in the US. Even with their victory, it still took 2 more years for the Brotherhood to achieve their goal, as Pullman repeatedly deadlocked meetings and fought to maintain the status quo. Finally, in 1937, a contract was written up between the Brotherhood and Pullman, which raised the minimum wage of both porters and maids, established a basic 240 hours of work a month, time and a half overtime pay for any more than 260 hours work, and that the company would pay for a porter's uniform after 10 years of employment. For the first time, a written, legal agreement was made between a black union and a major company. The struggles of Randolph, Tucker, and countless other members had finally paid off.
Here was a handful of colored people. So, got together here and took on the Pullman Company. You know the Pullman Company is one of the most powerful industrial institutions in the nation. How the hell did you figure to win? And we're still wondering, how the hell did you do it? Mr. Randolph said, well, Mr. Carey, we've thought about it a lot. We've talked about it a lot. We're not too sure ourselves.
But the story of the Brotherhood doesn't end there. Years later, in 1942, the union had expanded to Canada, helping guarantee better pay and working conditions for Canadian porters too. Back in the US, the fact that a black union was proven to be achievable was enough to motivate others to act all across the country, and laid the foundation for all other major civil rights movements that followed. With the Brotherhood established, Randolph went on to become a significant figure in the civil rights movement, with many of the other founding members working with and helping grow other black-led unions and civil rights campaigns. Even the porters themselves, already well-respected figures in their community, used their position to educate others on what it took to start a union and fight for equality, both in the workplace and socially. In 1955, during the arrest of Rosa Parks, it was a former porter, E.D. Nixon, who came up with and organized the boycott against the bus company, which helped get rid of segregated seating on public transport and in turn spurred on the movements of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters itself, it remained a significant force for many years. But by the 1960s, the decline in rail transport resulted in the union shrinking down to around 3,000 members from its once mighty 15,000. In 1978, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters merged with the Brotherhood of Railway and Airline Clerks, which in turn later became part of the Amtrak division of the union. It still exists to this day to some degree, but certainly not as the black American icon it once was. In the end, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters wasn't just another railroad union, but perhaps the launching point for countless black American civil rights movements, as it proved it was possible for those who were often downtrodden and mistreated by society to come together, organize, and make a better life for not just themselves, but for future generations too. I could go on, but I think Rosina Tucker herself put it best.
The porters knew that being a servant was simply a role that they put on and took off along with their uniforms. They weren't ashamed of being servants, but they never lost sight of the fact that first and foremost, they were men.